Who are the greatest Minnesota Vikings players of all time? Today we set out to find out that question by going through the top 10 Minnesota Viking players ever. I'll admit this was probably one of the toughest lists I've had to make in this series so far. The only list I'd say was tougher was the Pittsburgh Steelers list. The Minnesota Vikings have had so many great players play for them, and also so many great franchise legends that on any other team, franchise legends would end up making this list. But for the Vikings, I mean, it's tough. They have a lot of players who you're talking about as far as longevity goes, just don't have enough short-term accolades, and then guys who have some of the most short-term accolades you can get in a small amount of time who just didn't play long enough for the Vikings. And we're even talking about guys who are some of the greatest players, top 3 at their position all time, who didn't make this list. And I think where we're talking about honorable mentions, I think the most notable of these is probably going to be a shocker to some people, Randy Moss. I know he had he was a 3-time touchdown leader in his time with the Vikings, 3-time first-team All-Pro selection. It's hard, though, putting a guy who, number one, never led the league in receiving yards. I'm being a little bit critical about that. But also a guy who only played 6 seasons with the Vikings when you have so many legends all time. And at the end of the day, he just didn't contribute to a very successful era with the Vikings. That just didn't help in this case. In the case of the Minnesota Vikings, they've had so many all-time greats who've done more for them in more dominant eras. Other guys who I would say, Jared Allen, Chris Dolman, some of the greatest defensive players of all time, some of the greatest defensive primes of all time. Unfortunately, they were just too short-lived, especially with the Minnesota Vikings in the case of Jared Allen. That's why they just, weren't able to make this list. Chris Dolman, in the case of him, he only had 2 first-team All-Pro selections, and nothing really else. Not many Pro Bowlers, not many Pro Bowls, not many second-team All-Pro selections to back up a consistent level of play in comparison to some of these other Vikings legends. So it was hard putting him higher on this list. And Dolman was probably the toughest one exclusion I had from the Minnesota Vikings all-time list, all-time top 10, but he just missed out. And then other guys I would say that were honorable mentions, Jim Marshall just did not have any enough overall accolades compared to some of these other players, kind of paled in comparison to his fellow Purple People teammates. Justin Jefferson, I think the youngin who definitely has a chance to make this list down the line, but he's still got a ways to prove to even surpass Randy Moss before he gets into the top 10. And then we're talking about Harrison Smith, another guy who's played his whole career with the Minnesota Vikings, but just did not have enough accolades to make this list. So we'll start off at number 10. I'm going to go with Chris Carter. This is a guy, yes, he also only had 2 first-team All-Pro selections, but he's also a guy who finished his career with 1,300 receiving yards, majority of those coming with the Minnesota Vikings. Led the league in receptions once, led the league in touchdowns as many times as Randy Moss, which I thought was especially important, and was an 8-time Pro Bowler and 8-time 1,000-yard receiver with the Vikings. So basically did a lot more for the Vikings in a longer period of time. Held his own when the Vikings had that dominant 1998 season against Randy Moss, who was just taking the league by storm. Chris Carter is one of the best receivers of all time and definitely worth being on this list. He comes in at number 10. At number 9, I'm going to go with Carl Eller. Terrifying edge rushing presence for the Purple People leaders in the late 1960s, early 1970s. Finished his career with 133.5 sacks. And was a 5-time first-team All-Pro selection. Carl Eller was just absolutely dominant, a freak athlete. There's an argument he could have won the MVP back in 1968 or 1969, was an MVP finalist multiple times. So, Eller comes in at number 9, but it was tough putting him ahead of number 8, being that this guy is the all-time leading interception leader, and that's going to be number 8, Paul Krause. He had some, he had some dominant seasons with the Washington Commanders early on in his career. Two-time first-team All-Pro selection with them, and 28 interceptions with them. But he had 53 interceptions with the Vikings, which on any other organization that would, probably put him top 5 on this list. Just not enough for the Vikings. He did not have as many accolades per se as some of his teammates in that same era, but we're talking about he still had several second-team All-Pro selections, several Pro Bowl appearances. You're talking about 8-time Pro Bowler. That's definitely enough to warrant a spot on this list. We're talking about one of the greatest returners ever as far as a defensive back goes, a guy who, revolutionized ball hawking and, was a playmaker in the same way that Darrelle Revis was. I think if PBUs were a stat back then, he would have even better stats than Darrelle Revis, and that's ridiculous to say, but Paul Krause was really that good, and he deserves his spot on this list, and he comes in at number 8 for that reason. At number 7, I'm going to go with Adrian Peterson. Just one of the most complete running backs of all time. We're talking about a guy who is all power, all speed. We're talking about a guy who was just really good as far as his ability to take a ball on a wheel route all the way to the house. He was all everything, and he was all day. He was that nickname, and he could play all day, and he was that good all throughout the game. He has several records in NFL history, including the most rushing yards in a game. He started his career with 7 straight seasons of double-digit touchdowns, and then had one season where he didn't play that much in 2014, and then came back and then led the league in receiving touchdowns. Just absolutely ridiculous numbers throughout his entire career. Led the league in rushing yards 3 times, 4-time first-team All-Pro selection with the Vikings, and on top of that was three-time second-team All-Pro selection, won the MVP in 2012, carried them that year to the playoffs. He's one of the greatest running backs of all time. There's no doubt about that, in my opinion. I think if he had played his whole career with the Vikings, maybe a couple seasons longer, he would definitely be top 5. But that is how tough this list is, in my opinion. At number 6, I'm going to go with Mick Tingelhoff. I would argue could have been an MVP candidate as a center. 6-time first-team All-Pro selection in the 60s. I think arguably the best hands by a center ever, as far as his ability to just lock down and anchor a player who was a nose tackle. His prime was relatively short for all-time great centers, but relatively long for a lot of these Vikings all-time great players on and off the list. And he was a key contributor and a captain to the Vikings when they ended up making 4 Super Bowls in the late 60s and the early 70s. And I think he gets some brownie points for being the anchor to the Vikings' run offense that was so prevalent with another guy who's on this list who we'll get to eventually. He's one of the best centers of all time, and he comes in number 6. At number 5, I'm going to go with Ron Yari, tackle for the Vikings around the same time, that Purple People era, in the 60s and the 70s. Just absolutely athletic freak off the right side. Some great feet. He was great at just being able to get a defensive end's back shoulder to be able to put them in a position where they lost their footing every time. He's a 6-time first-team All-Pro selection in his own right, and he deserves to be this high, in my opinion. For that reason, he was good both in the pass and the run game. And for those of you who are going to say that I'm biased to offensive line, I'm not biased to offensive line. Yes, I'm sympathetic to them. I don't think they get enough credit. And for those of you who complain that other players who are not offensive line should be on this list, I highly recommend for you guys to look into some of these guys. I highly recommend just looking in the offensive line position. As a former quarterback, these guys protect quarterbacks. They deserve a lot more credit than they get by most people. And, I I'd make an argument that this is probably the deepest position in NFL history. So for a guy like Ron Yari in one of the golden eras of offensive line to be able to hold his own and still have be a six-time first-team All-Pro selection, be the best right tackle six times in his career at a time where Forrest Gregg was dominating and Ron Mix was dominating at that same position. And same goes with Mick Tingelhoff. They deserve their flowers, and I think they deserve to be this high. And for that reason, Ron Yari comes in at number 5. At number 4, I'm going to go with Fran Tarkenton, a guy who played 2 different tenures with the Minnesota Vikings, one coming early on in the 1960s and then one coming on in the mid-70s. Fran Tarkenton is one of the top 5 dual-threat quarterbacks of all time. He led the league in rushing yards each of his first 4 seasons as a quarterback, most by a quarterback, that's what I mean. He was just incredibly elusive. We're talking about a guy who won MVP in 1975, who evolved his game later on in his career from a rusher to a passer, much like Randall Cunningham, another Vikings quarterback. We're talking about a guy who, when injuries hurt the Vikings offense, carried them in several playoff victories against some of the best teams ever, including the Cowboys, and kept them in games several times. We're talking about a guy who, laid the works for guys like Randall Cunningham, like Steve Young, like Michael Vick and Lamar Jackson after them. Fran Tarkenton is a huge reason for that. He's a guy who was extremely efficient as far as a quarterback goes, as far as situational football, and extremely clutch. And a guy who, if you look at the Vikings with and without him, they really, really needed him even more as far as just their overall offensive production goes. They were a good team without him because of how dominant their defense was. But when he was in the fold, they were damn near unstoppable, with the exception of maybe the Dallas Cowboys in the NFC. Several years where they barely lost ever in the mid-70s, only 2 losses in 3 of 4 straight seasons. Fran Tarkenton is the best Vikings quarterback ever, and in my opinion, he should be number 4, and he should be on the Vikings Mount Rushmore. At number 3, I'm going to go with John Randall, one of the most feared players of all time, great as both a pass rusher and a run stuffer. His ability to strafe in the middle was just amazing. All but 5 seasons of his career, he had, if I'm not mistaken, he played 14 seasons. All but 5 years of his career, he had double-digit sacks. 2 of those came with the Seahawks, so that doesn't even really matter in the context of this conversation. He finished his career with 137.5 sacks, which speaks to how good he was as a pass rusher, could play multiple different positions. I think was easily one of the most valuable defensive players of the 1990s. As far as you look at the defense without him, they're a very good defense, but John Randall was the reason why they were top 5 certain years. John Randall, his resume speaks for itself. 6-time first-team All-Pro selection with the Vikings. He comes in at number 3 for that reason. At number 2, I've never seen a Vikings list with this guy as high as he is. He should be this high. He's a 12-time Pro Bowler and a 7-time first-team All-Pro selection as a guard. Give me a break if you don't have him in your Mount Rushmore at the very least. That is going to be Randall McDaniel. I don't know what people can say about him that puts him lower on this list other than the fact that people have anti-bias against offensive linemen. He's one of the most dominant players ever at any position in the NFL. There are very few players in NFL history with the longevity and the dominance, the sheer dominance that he had at his position, and just the overall complete package that he was. He was an athletic freak, strong as hell, speedy, could play at all 3 levels as far as being able to block, great in the passing department, a mauler in the run game, rarely ever penalized, just flawless technique. There was nothing you could really say bad about Randall McDaniel, So I just don't understand why he doesn't get put higher on these lists for Minnesota Vikings players of all time. He comes in at number 2, in my opinion, for that reason. At number 1, however, we're going to go with Alan Page. Alan Page has the most ever sacks for a defensive tackle all time. Technically, it's unofficial, but he has 148 and a half sacks. He's one of only 2 defensive players ever to win MVP, the other being Lawrence Taylor. He won it in Alan Page won it in 1971, finished as an MVP finalist multiple times, and was arguably the best player, not just the best defensive player, the best player in the league multiple seasons. And Alan Page was strong, fast, and ate up so much space in the middle and was so valuable for that Purple People defense leader, and was a huge reason to why guys like Carl Eller and Jim Marshall were able to have as many opportunities as they were on the outside. Alan Page, for that reason, is the greatest Viking of all time, in my opinion, because he symbolizes the Purple People leader, the best era of Vikings, and in my opinion, before Aaron Donald came along, was the greatest defensive tackle ever.